Hi everyone, I'm going to make a video just about study techniques for English because they're quite different to other subjects. So even though students have had some kind of coaching on studying, I've sat through those and they don't often apply very well to English. So study techniques for English or climbing Mount Impossible, which is the HSC, 5 papers in 4 hours roughly. If you really don't want to watch this video, which will be pretty long, this is all you need to see that your student's doing. I don't really like the probability that this is actually going to be the case, but by all means, see if they're doing it on their own. So that would be, they are setting an alarm, and twice a week they're doing 10 minutes of action, not a kind of lofty goal like write a draft or something, but something very specific that they can time and do. So that would be unpacking a keyword and writing their own definitions and examples of what happens in the text, just spending a few minutes on that, rewriting some of those sentences in new ways so that they're kind of capable of doing it in exam conditions, finding good sentences from resources and mimicking them, taking out the keywords and writing them up themselves, or reading their notes and making questions out of them and emailing them to their peers. So if you can look in on them and see them doing that, then by all means ignore the rest of this video. What you'll hopefully see is them having a bank of keywords like this, which is what one of my students have made. And if you look at it just for a second, you will realize that it means absolutely nothing to anyone except that student. It is just a bunch of words, and their memory has to do all the work to make this meaningful and something they can use in their essay. And the reason we kind of do that very quickly is Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve. It's a well-replicated study, and it's really unsurprising that when you learn something, you forget it. When you revise it, you start to forget it slower, but you still do forget it. So you need to be retrieving the information you want quite often, otherwise basically you walk into that exam and there's not much there to help you. So if you're going to watch the video, here is the rest of it. So how do we get up Mount Impossible? It's two real questions we have to ask about when we're studying what we're doing. One is, what is likely to not fail and not create a sense of failure and demotivation, so doing something that you actually don't succeed at and makes you feel like not doing anymore, and what is actually effective in terms of the science of learning. So what we generally hear is they should do timed mock exams, but I would rate that as being fairly high up Mount Impossible, and they're probably likely to not do so well at it, and really on its own, it's not actually a very effective thing to do. It is an effective thing to do, but not on its own. So what goes into succeeding at a timed mock exam? Doing it with some notes instead. Doing just a timed body paragraph. Doing a timed body paragraph with some keywords that you've prepared for it, like you saw earlier. Actually getting that bank of notes and keywords together. And so for some students, kind of that really is the top of the mountain. They're not even that far, they're quite disorganized. So we can look at previous essays, we can maybe work them up with some friends, a tutor in the library, me, and take the keywords out of that, look at class resources and models that have been provided, look at lit charts and other study guides that are on the internet. And we get to that point where we have doing timed body paragraphs with a bank of keywords and that bank of keywords. So how do those two things interact and how are they useful? I kind of want to go through that in quite a lot of detail because on its face it seems simple, but students are still probably pretty likely to not get a lot of out of it. So in its own, it is quite high up Mount Impossible. So let's start with one thing we can do with those keywords, which is unpack them with a bit of a partial definition in the writing. So why do we want to do this? If we just keep repeating some fancy words, it is really unconvincing in our essays. So let's read this. This is really close to something a student actually turned in last year. Ali Cobby Eckermann's poems are about intergenerational trauma. Her use of metaphor helps us understand intergenerational trauma. By engaging with the poems, we understand intergenerational trauma and change our views about intergenerational trauma. Not very convincing. So it doesn't tell us what they think intergenerational trauma means. So the good thing would be to just stop and spend a few minutes writing out your best definition, some examples of it, just in terms of what happens in the poems that might be it. So We could call it a hardship or misfortune that not only affects the person, but can create a cycle of family dysfunction that is hard to break. It is hard to provide an example of functional family life if you yourself have had the family unit broken up by circumstance or the state in terms of the stolen generations. That is going to be more convincing, and if we look at what we write, we have a whole lot of little phrases here: cycle of family dysfunction, family unit broken. If we start putting these words in our paragraph instead of just repeating the same term over and over again, that's going to look more convincing. I had a student, kind of a student for everything they've ever turned in. Their trial exams, the word Machiavellian appeared 27 times with no commentary on what it meant in their trial exam. And they didn't do very well, despite being a pretty good student. So let's see what that looks like when we put the partial definitions into the paragraph. Ali Cobby Eckermann's poems are about intergenerational trauma. Cool. Her use of metaphor helps us understand not the same thing, the cyclical nature of family dysfunction. By engaging with the poems, we understand the role the Australian state has played in disrupting the family unit of Aboriginal Australians and how a culture of acknowledgement can break this cycle. So we're starting to extend what we want to say about the keyword. So that is one way we can actually start getting the keywords and practicing how we might use them in a timed body paragraph so that we succeed and are learning something. So, unpacking keywords with a partial definition. That is something you can spend your study time doing, and it's very effective very quickly. So, I just want to kind of stop and think about why this works. So to do that, we need a quick revision of cognitive load theory and working memory, which is something I've usually sent parents a video on before, but I've taken over a fairly large amount of classes, so if you would like that video, by all means ask me. I'm sure this will do though. So it is something that has been put out by Centre for Education Statistics and Evaluation. It's not just in New South Wales, it's a kind of idea about learning that's starting to get more traction. Now, it's been around since the 80s, or the 90s I think. Dylan Williams, one of my favourite educationalists, one who actually teaches in a classroom, says it is the single most important thing for teachers to know. And one of the things it helps us understand is the role of retrieval practice, i.e. just constantly trying to remember things. So what happens with revision usually is students test themselves to see if they know something, rather than out of the belief that practicing retrieval itself will help them learn. If they can recall something once, they believe they have learnt it, so they remove this from their study methods. But in actual fact, it enhances long-term meaningful learning. It's really necessary to do something well. So this is a common metaphor to explain cognitive load theory, and often used in cognitive psychology. We basically have our IQ, which we can represent as a chef, talented, quick. We have our working memory, which is where we do the stuff we're doing, and it has a pretty limited capacity, and it's a bit of a bottleneck. And then we have our long-term memory. These things are kind of fixed. There's not much we can do about them, but our long-term memory is very malleable, and if you're old, you will know this, because there's lots of junk in there about pop culture or something that happened in a film in the 80s. So what we want to do is basically get it very well organized. So cognitive load theory basically is students need to consistently spend time retrieving memories so they become organized so as to avoid cognitive overload. So they're not getting a bottleneck in their working memory, which is quite limited. So this is kind of what happens when someone's actually doing something, like in an exam. We can fit roughly 5 unique things in our working memory, our chopping board, and they're all important, but we are dropping other things on the ground. We are making simple mistakes that if we had a memory aid, we could avoid making, like we do when we're drafting. And these things are often very important. What is the significance of what I'm talking about? Have I actually provided any examples, or I just keep restating the same opinion? So once we are expert at something, basically, there's not a lot of conscious thought going on. It's all automatized memory function, and we're thinking about one thing here, intergenerational trauma, and all these things are kind of happening more or less without us even really thinking about them. And the analogy would be, we've been to the cupboard so many times, we've organized it, so that all the things we need are right next to each other. And so this doesn't happen by using a laptop, by using resources, textbooks, etc. We're never actually getting anything into long-term memory that way. We have to keep working with it in our working memory and then going back to our long-term memory to stop that forgetting curve of things kind of fading away. So, one of the things we looked at was unpacking a keyword with a partial definition, actually thinking about what the word means for our argument. So another thing we can do is once we've got that unpacked keyword, we can kind of rework it by shifting the words around a little bit, trying to write it in a slightly different way. So if we look at intergenerational trauma and the way the stolen generations broke down the authority structure of Aboriginal society is a key theme of the poems. So we've got trauma as a noun. What if we switch it to traumatize, the verb? The policy of removing children from the community not only traumatizes that parent and child, but disrupts subsequent generations' cultural identity and understanding of family and community. So we actually start to get different ideas emerging, which extends our understanding of the word, and we can express it in a variety of different ways. So I can remember it in exam conditions, which is important because learning is a change in long-term memory, as the founders of cognitive load theory identify. Just having produced a number of drafted Turnitin submissions does not demonstrate actual learning. Okay, not only could they basically cheat, they get help with drafting. So no matter how much they reread or edit their draft to make it better, that's not actually a change in long-term memory. So they're not actually learning, and that is going to show up in an exam. And another reason we might rearrange the sentence in a multitude of ways is that then you can express it in exam conditions without needing a teacher to fix the draft, fix the grammar, point out that it's kind of gibberish and a bunch of keywords thrown together. And that is important because learning is a relatively permanent change of behaviour. It's what you actually do, not something you do once. It's what you continue to do in a permanent way. So they must be able to write well without any aid or aids. No laptop, no bank of notes, no tutor, no English teacher. So helping them draft cannot significantly influence how they will write in exam conditions. And what most students ask us to do is look at their draft. Can you look at my draft? Can you look at my draft? Am I doing it right? Can I fix it? And it's a heavy time cost to do that, and it is not effective either. So basically, we want to step away from a reliance on the laptop for studying. If your child is always in front of a laptop, it's not effective study because it is not making them remember anything. So we looked at unpacking, we looked at reworking. Now we'll look at a pretty simple one, which is mimic and rehearse some good formal expression, because that is often what they struggle with. They can talk about it in class, it makes sense in their own head, but they have to express it formally. So here's just a random thing from a class resource. You can find it pretty much anywhere. Hatton pushes us to see how broad our civic responsibilities need to be, how we must all have awareness of neurological difference if we want to look at the welfare of everyone in our societies. It's not going to mean anything to you, but it is a formal expression of something that happens in Curious Incident. So what they can do is just write out the $5 words, leave some spaces on their page, and then cover the laptop or the notebook or whatever, and try to recreate the sentence as best they can. Even kind of walk away, do a sit-up, brush your teeth, and then come back. Let a little bit of forgetting happen. Try to recreate it. Start taking away more of the keywords as they recreate it. Maybe even take all the actual $5 words out, the fancy, high, sophisticated vocabulary, and just put the basic joining prepositions and stuff in and see if they can recreate those high-impact vocab stuff. So they're just moving between working memory and long-term memory, trying to make this get organized down here. And yes, they can remember it, they can express it in exam conditions quickly. Okay, the last one is bringing your notes alive, actually doing something with them. So we go back, we read our notes, all modules, not just the most recent one. We turn them into questions. We email them to our friends or peers or whatever, and in turn we ask them to send us their questions back and we answer them. So we might have in our notes something basic like class, T's, transporter, bridge, Swan Lake. and hopefully we need to remember what that is actually about. We might need to ask the teacher. And then we try to turn into a question. What technique is Doldry using when he shows the combination of the Tees transporter bridge at the same time as the music of Swan Lake? What does this reveal about Billy's life? So just anything like that is prompting their long-term memory rather than it just being all on a computer somewhere. We can kind of organize these questions in a question quadrant, which is there's the text world, what happens to the characters and the plot. So, what is an opinion? Why does this thing happen in the story, which has a fairly open-ended nature to it? Some basic closed stuff, like who helps Chris create coping mechanisms in Curious Incident. Just, basic stuff. All of it is useful. And then we can get to the world level of the text, where it's the composition, what genres does the novel fit into, what issues or concepts are being explored, to what extent can we relate to the protagonist, etc. is more open-ended question. It's more personalized. So we want a range of those questions to ask our peers and get from our peers. Okay, so if we start doing that, we are climbing up Mount Impossible. We get to the point where we're doing timed mock exams. We maybe even start looking at past papers and the module rubric and thinking about how we can express the ideas in it. So the basic motto of studying is don't set goals, set actions. So rewrite my Mod A essay. That is something that could take and would likely involve a lot of procrastination and take a lot of time. We want to avoid procrastination hell. It is just not useful to sit there in agony trying to do something very hard and failing. Instead, spend 10 minutes just unpacking some keywords that you do know. It's doable. It reinforces your own competence. What we want to see is set 2 alarms a week, 10 minutes action doing these things. And that is how we will climb Mount Impossible. It's firstly smart work, so we're motivated, and then hopefully we can get ourselves to the point that we can work hard because we know we're succeeding. Alrighty, cheers.